William Bridges says that it isn't the changes that do us in, it's the transitions. Change is not the same as transition. Change is situational. The new job, the new minister, the graduation, the wedding, the diagnosis. Transition is the process of coming to terms with a new situation. The first phase is letting go, dealing with the loss. The second phase is an in-between time when the old is gone and the new isn't fully formed, a neutral zone. I call it the wilderness. The third phase is coming out of the transition, making a new beginning. Now, I don't know much about bunk beds, having no children or grandchildren. Mostly, I know bunk beds from backpacking in the Smoky Mountain National Park in Tennessee. In the backcountry shelters, there are rows of bunk beds together in a sleeping rack, upper and lower bunks. One night, while trying to sleep, in the midst of snoring hikers, the guy next to me punched me and whispered, wake up, look." And I looked up at the chain-link fence that stretched across the open side of the shelter separating us from the forest. Standing on hind legs, with paws and claws shaking the glass cage, was a black bear, bigger than anything I had ever seen in the woods. So I always associate bunk beds with bears. Truth be told, at the time, I knew next to nothing about bears. I had heard that there were some in Chicago. Little ones at Wrigley Field, monster ones at Soldier Field. And I knew that bears tend to group themselves under common family names like brown, black, polar, Kodiak, and grizzly. I heard that some are more dangerous than others, although we city types had all fear domesticated out of us as children by the likes of teddy bears, Yogi bears, and especially Pooh Bear, whose adventures from everything from the honey pot to the Huffalumps brought me great pleasure once, and when I stumble across it again, always brings me pleasure still. But while you are pondering your own youthful associations with bears, I would have you consider this incident. When I was a pastor in Grand Junction, a group of us visited the mountains of Montana after a week of Bible school at the Blackfeet Reservation near Browning. This is Glacier National Park. I was awed and even a little frightened by the scale and power of the wilderness. Whether buildings or bridges or even hiking trails, the creations of human beings seemed by comparison precariously inadequate, infinitely finite, and fragile. Back east, where I grew up, nature was preserved, contained, and revered. High in the Rockies, it is the opposite. Here we had to be wary of nature, lest in a blind moment she consume us all. Everywhere signs warned of the bears. They can swim, run, and climb faster than any human being, and they have been known to attack without provocation. So we drove up to the end of the road to Two Medicine Lake, where there is a general store and a boat that will ferry you across the lake to the far shore. On the porch, there was a ranger, drinking a cup of coffee, watching the hummers, enjoying this view. I interrupted his reverie as I was more than casually concerned about one of us being eaten by a grizzly. "Get many bears up here, do ya?" I asked. "Well, sometimes we get quite a few." "How about on that easy trail across the lake? Any chance of running to any of them this morning, so close to the store?" Well, he paused long enough to hear the question behind the question and took a slow sip of his coffee. "If I could tell you for sure that there wouldn't be any bears, it wouldn't be a wilderness. Now, would it?" I thanked him for his candor, and then we went on our hike. Rabbi Lawrence Kushner reflects, maybe that is all it ever comes down to. You can walk where things are predictable, or you can enter the wilderness. Without the wilderness, there can be neither reverence nor revelation. I now know that there is more to wilderness than Montana. And I know that bears come in multiple sizes and disguises, to the degree that meeting one is nigh unto unavoidable, just like the middle of a transition. So let's start with the wilderness. It's everywhere. One finds it in every region and in every religion. I know of no religion without one or two wilderness stories. They're universal. People wander in the wilderness. Others are tried, tempted, and tested in the wilderness. Still others are banished to the wilderness, and having entered it, are given up for lost in the wilderness. Fairy tales, too, are full of wilderness. In fairy tales, the wilderness is sometimes called the woods, sometimes the forest. Some places are enchanted for some, foreboding for others. It depends on how you arrive there the first time you go there. Do you approach the wilderness merrily or warily? Does your fairy godmother guide you through it? Or does the wicked stepmother abandon you to it? I find it interesting, although not surprising, that we were not deterred from our hike by anything that the ranger told us about grizzlies. As Kushner said, maybe that is all it ever comes down to. You can walk where things are predictable, or you can choose to enter the wilderness. But without the wilderness, there can be neither reverence nor revelation. Which is an interesting notion, for I am suggesting that there are good things to be gained by going where the bears go. Certainly, there are Indian tribes who equate a fortnight in the wilderness with a young man's ticket into adulthood. He goes into the wilderness a boy, and he comes out of the wilderness a man. And today, girls make similar journeys. Outward bound programs abound. There are many who believe that all of us would benefit from them, even as troubled teenagers often find their last best chance of salvation wrapped in them. To be sure, there are risks attendant in these kinds of ventures, but I don't see any lessening of their appeal, which means that there must be benefits there, even blessings. Did I say blessings? Well, yes, I did. But for a moment, hold that thought, trusting that I'll eventually circle back around to it. If I have any quarrel with Rabbi Kushner, it's with his notion that you can choose to walk where things are predictable. You can't. That's because the wilderness is a creeping thing which has its way of finding you. meaning that you can meet a bear almost anywhere. I remember the day my doctor said, "I hate to be a bad news bear." Really? Or the bearer of bad news. But it is cancer. Funny that she would equate cancer with a bear, which it is, of course, a real bear, I mean, not the woodsy one, but a formidable one, which only goes to prove that if you go walking long enough, you'll meet a bear or two, or four or more. So how, pray tell, will you live in their presence? Now hold on to that thought, too, for just a moment, and let's jump to Jacob. Jacob of Genesis fame, son of Isaac, father of Joseph, brother of Esau, whom you will remember he tricked out of his inheritance and pretty much got away with it. Sure, he had to vacate the country for a few years, but like that cream that rose to the top of those milk bottles that I drank as a child, Jacob pretty well floats to the top. He has a beautiful wife, multiple children, lots of servants, lots of money. 20 years later, Jacob is planning to come home. His plan is to make peace with his brother Esau. The final night of his journey, he camps alone along the river in the wilderness, where someone shows up and tackles him clear out of the blue. And the fight goes on all night long. First, the stranger winning, then Jacob winning, and then the stranger winning. And as daybreak threatens to illuminate the arena, the stranger realizes that the tide is turning back towards Jacob. So the stranger gives Jacob a low blow, throwing Jacob's hip out of joint permanently. And then the stranger, this nocturnal adversary, makes like he's going to leave. Which is where the story gets a little weird for me, for if I were Jacob, leaving is exactly what I'd want this stranger to do. Yes, by all means go. Get out of here, and the sooner rather than later. You've ambushed me, you've battled me, and you've crippled me. Be gone. Amazingly, Jacob doesn't say that. Instead, holding his adversary in a vice-like grip, he says, "I will not let you go until you bless me." So who is Jacob fighting in the wilderness? At night, all night, through the night. God? Maybe. An angel? Maybe. His own guilt? Maybe. All three? Maybe. We're never going to know. And it matters relatively little if we ever know. All we need to know is that Jacob's foe is an adversary with the power to cripple. And if you have never met one of those in your life so far, an adversary with the power to cripple, you are very lucky. Because there are bears in the wilderness, and because the wilderness creeps so as to make it unavoidable. Well, what about this blessing, you ask? And I told you I'd return to it. Notice, dear ones, that in this beloved Bible story, the blessing does not precede the attack, nor does the blessing prevent the attack. The blessing is sought and received in the attack from the attacker. It's as if Jacob is saying, can I, even in the midst of this transition, this for which I did not want, did not seek, did everything I possibly could do to avoid, can I experience something, receive something, learn something that will deepen my reverence for life and reveal something about God that I did not know before and would have missed had this not happened. It's not totally unlike the little boy when confronted on a room with a room full of manure on Christmas morning, choked back his tears, and began searching for the pony that he knew had to be in there somewhere. Now, I don't pretend that this is easy. For like you, I'm not in the habit of seeking blessings after all-night fights. And if the Jacob story is correct, these blessings don't just pop up at you or fall like manna from heaven on you. Sometimes you just have to hold on for dear life and scream, "Give me something! Show me something! Teach me something that I can get no other way." Go back to cancer, which hits many of us in the night. For even if you receive that diagnosis at high noon, the word itself tends to turn everything dark. Sometimes I compare cancer to a stranger with a suitcase who walks up your steps, your front porch steps, and rings the doorbell. And when you open the door, he says nary a word. Instead, he walks past you and starts climbing the stairs to your second story. Following him, you protest, wanting to know who he is and what in the world does he think he's doing. Tersely, he answers that he is moving into your front bedroom. You tell him your front bedroom is not available for occupancy. You tell him you have not advertised that bedroom for boarders. You tell him that you aren't looking for someone to move in, don't want someone to move in, neither do you have the time or space for someone to move in. You even tell him that you don't understand how someone could just ignore your wishes and barge in anyway. But all the while, the stranger is simply unpacking the suitcase, moving your stuff over here, making room for his stuff. Socks and underwear in the drawer, slacks and shirts in the closet. Unable, at least at that moment, to evict him, you have to decide two things. How are you going to live with your front bedroom occupied? And two, is there anything that this experience can add to your life? These are the questions of the wilderness. These are the questions that transitions ask. So after hearing this sermon, I figure that some of you will text me. Janet, as concerns this place where we find ourselves, your wilderness and my wilderness, are there perchance any bears there? Which is an acceptable question deserving an honest answer. But let it be followed by a second question, one that sometimes looks like this. Janet, as concerns the place where we find ourselves, your wilderness and my wilderness, is there perchance any beauty there? Beauty, beast. Beauty, beast. Funny, isn't it? That life doesn't offer beauty or the beast. No, the second word is not or. The second word is and. Amen.